you can all hear me. Can you hear me now? Is that right?
Yes.
What I thought I'd do this morning, if you'll permit, is to give a bit of an overview, not just of restitution, but why my office in the State Department exists and what we strive to do. And I presume I've left time for questions, and we can get into some of the nitty-gritty of whatever you want to talk about. The reason I don't want to go too far into details about restitution is that Dan Mariotti is here, and he knows a lot more about it than I do. So I can refer all questions to Dan in a minute if I get in trouble. But thank you, again, thank you for inviting me to speak this morning. As I said, let me just sketch out why the State Department has an office such as mine. And I should start by saying something I think everyone knows very well, that although it's almost 70 years since the Holocaust finally came to an end, its ghosts still haunt us in many ways. We can see them in international criminal tribunals where perpetrators are brought to justice for committing crimes against humanity and genocide. We can see them in the increasing numbers of academic programs that link Holocaust and genocide studies. We can see them in the doctrine adopted by the entire international community called responsibility to protect. Just recently, too, speaking at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which now has a committee on conscience dedicated to highlighting and combating present-day attempts at genocide, President Obama announced the creation of an atrocities prevention board. He devoted half of that speech to the lessons of the Holocaust, the prime one being never again. The Holocaust was also a crime unparalleled in human history. Because of the dimensions of this crime and the historical legacy it has left, the United States government simply cannot ignore it. There is too much still left undone, too many wrongs still left unrighted for that. For a variety of reasons, too, many people feel that only the United States has the ability to help others to deal with these problems, these wrongs to be righted. This is why the Department of State has an office of the Special Envoy for Holocaust issues. Because the Holocaust was a criminal act, the search for justice and recompense must inevitably come into play. Unfortunately, experience has shown that there can never be perfect justice. The principal task of a Special Envoy for Holocaust issues is thus to try to achieve a measure of justice, admittedly imperfect justice at best, for victims of the Holocaust and their heirs. It has been rightly said that in addition to being a crime against humanity of unique proportions, the Holocaust was also the largest theft in history. Someone has called it grand larceny on an epic scale. It's no accident then that the restitution of property, which includes works of art confiscated by the Nazis and their allies, currently forms the principal focus of the Special Envoy's work. Now, different countries in Europe have different records and different rates of success in returning property or in compensating for its loss. At the apex, perhaps understandably, given the Nazis' central role in perpetrating the Holocaust, stands Germany, which according to some calculations I've seen, has paid roughly $100 billion in various forms of compensation since the end of the Second World War. Austria and France, in different ways too, came much later to admissions of complicity in the Holocaust, but they've now done so as well. Like Germany, each of these countries has set up various programs to assist and compensate victims of National Socialism. Other Western European countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, even Switzerland, though granted the latter was in part moved to do so because of lawsuits against its banks filed in American courts, have also examined their pasts and in smaller ways tried to make amends. Unfortunately, the farther east you go, into what we used to call the new democracies of Central Europe and beyond, the less the countries there have followed this example. To be sure, some of these new democracies in the early 1990s enacted laws that restored properties both taken by the Nazis and nationalized by the communists. But often these were less than ideal, most commonly because they required one to be a citizen of the country to have one's property returned. For Holocaust survivors who had left and never returned, and for their heirs, this was a difficult hurdle to overcome. In other countries, most notably Poland, no attempt to adopt legislation that would deal with Holocaust property thefts has succeeded. In the Baltic states, where the extermination rate of Jews was extremely high, the return of Jewish communal property is still a sensitive political issue. After a decade of effort, Lithuania has finally adopted a law that would partly compensate the Jewish community for its losses, while we continue to urge Latvia to do the same. If you move even farther east to Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, which once also had large Jewish communities, and in some cases still do, the picture is even more bleak. With each year that passes, this work grows more difficult. New generations rise to power with small memory and little knowledge of their Holocaust-related past. They have little feeling that they must make amends for what happened in their countries. Many equate their sufferings under communism with what Jews underwent in the Holocaust. This, my colleague Hannah Rosenthal would term Holocaust relativism, and which is a form in her view at least, and in many others, of anti-Semitism. In addition, many of the very people we seek to help, those who managed to survive the Holocaust, are not getting any younger. Their numbers decline every year, and this happens to all of us as we get older. We develop physical infirmities and sometimes mental disabilities. For those who survived work camps and death marches in what should have been the prime of their lives, these infirmities and disabilities can be even more severe than most of what Hamlet in Shakespeare's famous soliloquy called the ills the flesh is heir to. What's more, too many survivors in this country, in Israel, and in Europe, and I would guess in Latin America and other parts of the world as well, live in poverty. This is why recent international meetings on Holocaust-era assets have put the use of heirless property to provide social and medical support to aging and indigent Holocaust survivors high on the agenda as well. And this is high on the agenda too, I should add. Our attempts to help Holocaust survivors, however, sometimes lead us to take positions that seem counterintuitive to many. The prime example is probably Holocaust-era insurance. As part of a series of comprehensive, I'm going to stumble over this next phrase because my lawyers made me put it this way, so forgive me. As part of a series of comprehensive settlements of litigation related to Holocaust-era claims facilitated by the United States of America during the Clinton administration, now I pause for breath, the United States entered into agreements with Germany in the year 2000 and with Austria and France in January 2001. Under the first agreement, Germany paid roughly $5 billion in various forms of compensation to Holocaust survivors. In return for these payments, the U.S. made something of a novel pledge. We said that should people bring suit in federal courts against German and Austrian companies, for their conduct during the Second World War, we would recommend dismissal of these suits on any valid legal grounds. The shorthand term for this is legal peace. Something like a tenth of the German compensation payments under this agreement went to the International Commission for Holocaust-era Insurance Claims, ICHEC for short. ICHEC had actually been created a couple of years before by a combination of European insurance companies and American state insurance commissioners as an alternative to litigation. But this injection of cash gave ICHEC some needed momentum. Over its almost decade in operation, ICHEC received roughly 100,000 claims for insurance policies and paid roughly half of those. To be sure, 2/3 of these payments were the amount of $1,000. These were called humanitarian payments and were made to people who had a plausible story, but no proof of an insurance policy. ICHEC was not always, and as some people here today can attest, a model of administrative efficiency. But it did provide a useful service, and it did help thousands of people, albeit perhaps in a relatively small way. But many survivors were convinced they were cheated. They believe that $20 billion worth of insurance policies still lie hidden in the vaults of various European insurance companies, most notably Allianz of Germany and Generali of Trieste. They cite calculations by a certain economist to back this claim. Even though many reputable non-governmental organizations that were involved in iCheck cast doubt, with I think good reason, on these claims and these calculations, they do persist. They also led to the introduction in every Congress of legislation that would facilitate suit against German and Austrian insurance companies. These bills would block the ability of the executive branch to file statements of interest with courts recommending dismissal of Holocaust-related claims against German and Austrian companies. They would also provide for suits against European insurance companies in federal courts and would validate state laws that allow for suit against European insurance companies in state courts. For those of you unfamiliar with the U.S. federal system, this may not make a lot of sense, but believe me, if there are lawyers in the room, they can explain this to everyone later. It makes a difference to our work. These bills may effectively supersede a Supreme Court decision handed down in 2003 that said that a California state law allowing for lawsuits against insurance companies to recover unpaid Holocaust-era life insurance policies was in conflict with and preempted by federal government foreign policy prerogatives. Now, the State Department has for many years continued or has proposed such legislation. Because of this, we are often accused of depriving Holocaust survivors of their day in court. That's not the intent, but it does seem to be a widespread perception. I also suspect that if these survivors want to get their day in court, they would find that the days would turn into months and the months. If these survivors were to get their day in court, they would find that the days would turn into months and the months into years. This is time and perhaps money that many of them do not have. Such litigation, after all, is rarely swift and rarely smooth. The website of the Holocaust Survivors Foundation, which is one of the greatest advocates for legislation before Congress, has an interesting section called Generali Litigation Timeline, 1997 to 2010. Despite contentions that through the U.S.-German executive agreement we have denied survivors their day in court, this litigation proceeded after that agreement was signed and in 2008 resulted in a settlement which was then appealed on the grounds apparently that it was not generous enough. 2 years later, the appeal was denied. I mention all this partly because of maybe on the minds of some of you, and partly because I think the background is also interesting in why our policy on restitution in general is what it is. It's events like this, the lengthy and expensive nature of litigation in American courts, that have prompted the United States government to favor alternatives to litigation, such as iCheck, as a measure to dealing with claims. In similar fashion, we advocate for open, transparent, and speedy processes for Holocaust-related property claims in Central and Eastern Europe. In fact, that's mainly what I try to do with not always tremendous success, I have to admit. We would like to see these claims removed from courts to the extent possible and placed into claims commissions where people actually, we think, have a better chance of getting some measure of recompense for what was taken from them. In many ways, other ways too, we seek additional support, medical, social, and other, for survivors, especially as they enter their final years. Their passing represents not just a personal loss for their families, friends, and admirers, but also for our society as a whole. Holocaust survivors are our best witnesses too, the best teachers of what happened in the Holocaust. When they are no longer with us, we shall need to find new ways to teach new generations about the Shoah. It is therefore a heartening sign that more and more museums and memorial sites are coming into existence. There is also an increasing array of governmental and non-governmental organizations dedicated to this work. The United States is, for instance, a founding member of the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research. This task force began in 1998 with actually 3, but very quickly 5 members. Today it has 31 and more people seeking to join, more countries I should say. Similarly, the United States also has a seat on the board of the trustees of the German foundation called Remembrance, Responsibility, and the Future, which was established by the agreement I mentioned a few minutes ago to make nearly $2 billion in payments to forced and slave laborers. Once these payments were made, the German parliament, having set aside funds in the enabling legislation in order to keep the foundation operating in perpetuity, ensured that it became a grant-making institution with an international board of trustees and a mission to keep the memory of victims of National Socialism alive. Almost 40% of its grants each year now go to humanitarian programs to benefit former forced and slave laborers as they enter their final years. And the remainder support Holocaust education and human rights programs designed to keep the lessons of the past in front of present and future generations. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, which celebrated its 60th anniversary this year, does similar work on a larger scale for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust in Europe, in Israel, in the United States, and around the world. It too devotes some of the funds it receives from Germany for this work to educational and cultural efforts, so that the lessons of the Holocaust are not lost when the last survivor passes from the face of the earth. As time passes and the Holocaust recedes farther into history, the importance of keeping the history and the lessons of the show alive will only increase. If we fail to learn its lessons, that is, as George Santayana would put it, if we fail to learn from the past, then we are quite likely to see something like it repeated again. I think we can all agree that that should not happen. This is why I also think there is much focus today on preventing present and future genocides through the study of the Holocaust. In fact, as far as I can tell, an increasing number of universities link Holocaust and genocide studies and place them together as a single unit of academic study. We should not see this as some kind of diminution of the Holocaust. It was, after all, Raphael Lemkin, a learned and Jewish international lawyer from Poland, who found records in the United States, who coined the term genocide. This term first appears, I believe, in a monograph he published in 1943 called Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, in which he analyzed the crimes of the Nazis from a legal perspective. He saw genocide first and foremost as a crime. From this notion of genocide as a crime, many things have followed. Although the concept as genocide had not yet been adopted as an international crime, soon after war's end, the Nuremberg tribunals placed many of the most important Nazi leaders in the dock for crimes against humanity. A new criminal charge which is defined as murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian population before or during the war, or persecutions on political, racial, or religious grounds in execution of or in connection with any crime within the jurisdiction of the tribunal, whether or not in violation of the domestic law of the country where it perpetrated. We can see the legacy of the tribunals today in the International Criminal Court and the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia, which both incorporate this legal concept. In the latter tribunal, too, government officials from Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina have been charged with a relatively new concept under international law, that of joint criminal enterprise. It strikes me that the Holocaust was a joint criminal enterprise on a vast scale, one that spanned an entire continent and beyond. But it was also more than that. It was also an attempt to single out certain communities, most particularly the Jewish population of Europe, for blame and then for extermination, as if this particular group of people, along with and maybe even the Slavic peoples as well, were not only responsible for all the evils in the world, but also did not belong in the same space as the predominant ethnic group, even if they had shared this space for centuries. As Lemkin put it, one of the lessons we learned from mass atrocities on such a scale is, and here I quote, that the diversity of nations, religious groups, and races is essential to civilization. This seems to me to be a good lesson to impart to forthcoming generations. Genocide may at bottom be the worst crime a state can commit against its people, but it is also a function of the loss of a sense of universality and commonality of those people, of a sense that we are all in this together. Where we single out others and condemn them for their differences from us, troubles inevitably follow. I saw this firsthand in my diplomatic service in the Balkans. There, a term coined by another person who had to flee the Nazis, Dr. Sigmund Freud, applied. He described the narcissism of small differences. But these small differences were enough to lead to a conflict in the 1990s that caused the International Court of Justice to find that genocide had committed in the small town of Srebrenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina as well. Still, the death and destruction in the Balkans or in Rwanda or in other areas of our modern world, however grim and gruesome they are, cannot be compared to that of the Holocaust. I would have said that the Holocaust was a unique event in history if the prominent Holocaust scholar, Professor Yehuda Bauer, had not taught me to say unprecedented instead. He uses the latter term, because he thinks that if we fail to derive the right lessons from it, such a thing could happen again. It is the hope and the goal of those of us who have been special envoys for Holocaust issues that we can contribute to the search for imperfect justice and for a more perfect history and memory of the Holocaust, so that those who come after us can truly say, never again. Thank you very much.
Time for questions, please. Question?
Question. Identify yourself. Phil Zagan, Midwest Region, Illinois. How does the German people allow a certain amount of monies to be compensated to the Holocaust survivors with the intent that they might say, well, wait a minute, this happened 60 years ago. We are not responsible for what our people did 60 years ago, but they are supposedly admitting responsibility. How is that responsibility determined by the amount of restitution that they actually give to the Holocaust survivors? Or is it just an arbitrary figure?
That's actually a very tricky, good question. I would actually say it's a combination of both. I think the first thing that all of those, probably in my position, come to recognize is that you can never truly compensate for what happened during the Holocaust. I think I was reminded of this. I think Dan and I, others here, were present when the Plains Conference celebrated its 60th anniversary this summer. And I thought one of the most interesting things was a video of a man named Saul Kagan reminiscing about the negotiations in the peace palace in The Hague that lasted 4 months. And they couldn't have been easy. I don't want to suggest that Germany just blindly said, yes, we'll pay everything back, no problem. This is not easy. The agreement in the year 2000 is not easy. So the German government, I can't speak for the people, but the German government has recognized that it has a responsibility to sort of render some form of justice to what the Nazi state committed. The German people were complicit in this. Whether, as I said, I don't think they've paid enough, as you might say, but the fact that they've done more than anybody else is, I think, some sign that they understand. And in my sense, I would ask my colleagues here, I don't want to speak for France, where after the Montioli Commission and a few other things, and President Mitterrand's speech, I think, in '95, was a great sea change. But I think that in one of the countries I deal with, there is no recognition that they had anything to do with it, or collaborators, anything bad happened. And so it's not enough, and in some cases it was grudging and difficult. But every year, to my surprise actually, the last 3 years in negotiations that the Plains Conference conducts with, and I have nothing to do with them, they're led by Stuart Eisenstadt, who is the special advisor to the Secretary of State who deals with this in a different capacity. The Germans have actually increased the amount of money they are paying to support survivors. So it's a question I really can't answer. It's a very good one. It would take probably a psychologist. All I can say is that what they paid is, on the surface, a lot of money. It probably doesn't really address what was done and what was taken. But I just don't know I do think if you look at surveys, I don't know if I've read done this with others, the level of anti-Semitism in Germany, while probably high, is not as high as it is in other European countries. And I think they've made an effort in education as well to deal with some of these things in a way that certain other countries I could mention, a little bit neighboring countries, in fact, Germany have not done so. So I have to give them points for doing what they've done, even if it was perhaps not enough.
Thank you.
Alan Jacobs, President. I just might call to the attention of this group that B'nai B'rith was one of the founders of the Material Claims Conference against Germany. And as a matter of fact, you're very active in it at the present time. And I, along with you and Dan, were at the 60th anniversary. And we continue to take an active part in the Material Claims Conference activities, where Dan sits as chairman of the Control Committee, and I sit as chairman of the Audit Committee of the Claims Conference. In addition, as you have properly mentioned, the Claims Conference did receive an considerable additional sums as a result of recent negotiations that took place, and the German government has continued to step up to the plate and to recognize their obligation, as we like to say, to those survivors of the Holocaust. Is there enough? No. There never will be enough for them, I think you would agree, that will ever compensate for what the survivors suffered. But at least we're attempting to make some sort of assurance that they do get something.
Yes, I'm going to take an opportunity to rectify the omission in my remarks here, because I didn't mention a very important organization to me, and I think to you as well, which is the World Jewish Restitution Organization, which I know Dan changes hats. Sandy wears hats when he goes to places like Croatia and
Increasingly, I have to.
and works with the World Jewish Restitution Organization. Many parts of the Claims Conference turn into the WJRO, and I think I'd like to believe we cooperate very closely, have the same goals, coordinate to the extent that we can. And I salute B'nai B'rith for also participating in that. It's not easy work. One thing that we were discussing earlier was a meeting that was set up by your organization in January in the rather imposing halls of the European Parliament in Brussels. If any of you have never been to I've not been to the Parliament in Strasbourg, but the building in Brussels puts the United States Congress to shame. You really realize where the a real world superpower is. I mean, it's an enormous place. Not only did we have this meeting about property restitution crime, which is a very good initiative trying to involve the European Parliament in propelling this kind of Holocaust-era restitution, but it was quite a good turnout of European parliamentarians, which I also credit to your work, because as I was saying, I wouldn't have expected such a good turnout. So in many ways, I apologize for the omission. Thank you for the opportunity.
Art in New Jersey. Douglas, I'd like to ask you, since you've become special envoy for Holocaust issues 2 years ago, what is the most surprising thing you've learned?
I think it's surprising. I mean, I'm not a professional. I've actually learned two things. I make jokes about lawyers, but I've learned to fake my way through a lot of legal terms now. That surprises me. I don't know. I think the way the resistance to somebody in the countries that we deal with now, I would not have expected to just, I mean, to me as a sort of a simple guy, if you steal something, you ought to give it back. You've taken somebody's property. It seems only right to return it. And the resistance to this, I find, or the reasons why we don't want to do this, which are sometimes a little bit far-fetched in certain countries I go to, I think that's the most surprising thing. It's just, I wouldn't have expected it to be so difficult in that way. Everyone always has a reason we can't afford this, or this or that, or we can't do special favors for certain groups. That, I think, maybe a related thing is the way that, as I was discussing this bill in Congress, there's also, I think, I won't mention people's names, but there's a certain congressperson who always saying terrible things about the State Department. I always thought we were sort of decent people, but anyway, I think this all is a package that sometimes the things that we do in this job, which I would think would be sort of a noble kind of thing, alienate people in ways I hadn't suspected, and I find it surprising. You all will probably understand this much better than I, but I think it's both surprising and difficult to level the type of resistance to some of the things that we, and I think quite often, deny with the WJRO and the claims conference thing. Makes perfect sense. I will cite the example of Hungary right now, which is going in the wrong direction. I don't know if anyone is from Hungary here today. It's not progressing in the right direction, and one of the manifestations of that is that it had been doing a very kind of an interesting thing to support Holocaust survivors, using heirless property, which is the largest piece, the largest chunk of property, and the most tragic, because of course when we've exterminated entire families, there's no one left to inherit it. And so it goes to the state normally. And the Hungarians, the previous government started to make payments based on how much heirless Jewish property there was in Hungary to support Holocaust survivors. 2/3 of it went to survivors overseas. It was run for the claims conference. I don't know whether it was going, whether you were, your organization. The Hungarians have just cut this off now. And the odd thing is the claims conference is putting more money into Hungary than it's getting from Hungary. So, you know, why at this point they would choose to do that, I don't know. But these are the things that surprise me. I mean, especially these democracies that we've supported and helped for 20-some years.
Thank you. Dan, you want to say a word?
Thank you, Michelle Marcus, past president, West Region, and part of the Illinois delegation here. Mr. Davidson, your discussions have been most interesting and informative on restitution, but I noticed you're a special envoy for Holocaust issues. Are there other issues that you get involved with that you could briefly just highlight, just to inform us on those as well?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing that surprised me was the range of things involved in the job. Because I thought, well, we'll come and deal with property restitution. But as I mentioned, this task force for Holocaust education, which is, I'm the head of the delegation, and also involved in a bunch of organizations that, don't quote me again, I'd never heard of until I started this job. One of them was called the International Tracing Service. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but it might be useful to some of you if you haven't. It's based in a place that's very difficult to get to in Germany called Bad Arolsen, a tiny town. We started in 1943. During the war, literally what the name suggests, it was tracing missing persons. And if you go there, it's almost like a museum because they've got old card files that people wrote by hand and with typewriters. And they have 50 million records of 17 million people. And today you can still write to them and ask if one of your relatives has disappeared, you don't know what happened. They'll try to find it, what happened for you. So they've got records of, not just during the war, but just from DP camps afterwards, passenger manifests from ships that went, in some cases, to Palestine if they could get there before Israel was raided, Canada, the U.S., all these things. It has an international commission. The U.S. has one of the 11 Cs. And over the course of the last decade, there's a big push from the Holocaust Memorial Museum and others here to open this up as an archive, which the service resisted, but now it's succeeded, so there was a whole new agreement signed this year. So now we have a case where something that's been run by the International Committee of the Red Cross since 1995 will now be run by, as it turns out, an American professor from the University of Maryland at Baltimore. She's about to start. So, as I said, this is one of the things I never heard of. This Holocaust Education Task Force was another. This German foundation that I just mentioned is really good. And,
you didn't name that service?
Pardon me?
You didn't name that service? That's open up?
International Tracing Service. They have a nice website. I think if you just Google ITS or International Tracing Service.
60 Minutes had a big segment about it
Yes.
last year.
Yeah. Was it last year or a couple of years ago?
Maybe 2 years ago. They explained it.
It wasn't easy because when I started the job, we were finishing up negotiations. that was one where the thing, we were on the opposite side of the Germans, and it wasn't so easy. It's quite an interesting place. It's a useful service. There are a number of other organizations like this, I think. And it seems to me that, I don't want to say that the restitution portfolio is going to diminish in importance, but I have the sense that education increases in importance precisely for the reasons I said, is the generation that actually experienced, lived through, survived, whatever, the Holocaust passes away. There's a lot of focus now on how do we perpetuate their experiences and their memories and not lose sight of, really what happened. And I think that's also important. And then the other part may be surprising as well is the extent to which I deal with members of Congress who are in the main very supportive. I do hope there's a resolution to be going to the Senate soon on restitution. I don't know whether you may know about that. There was some talk about it happening. So there's a lot of interest on the Hill. Most of it's good from my perspective. Sometimes as we come to Holocaust insurance, it's not so good from our perspective. Then there are bills against the French National Railways that I don't, it's more complicated than I can understand. But the congressional relations part is also interesting. Maybe be surprised to know that as I was when I started. I must be forgetting something.
I'd like to say a couple of words. Actually, B'nai B'rith was invited, and I participated in a small group of representatives of Jewish organizations that did go to Bad Arolsen and visited the ITS. And there was a little exercise. We could put in names of relatives, which I did, and they provided information right away. And it certainly is something that there is a website, as Doug said, and people should go to it because it's a tremendous. But I want to say something else. Actually, two other things quickly. When the question was asked about what did Ambassador Davidson find that was surprising, I would agree. I think what we have found also is, and there's kind of there's a disconnect. One would think that many of these countries in new democracies in Central, not including more Central and Eastern Europe, with their leadership, and many of the leaders of these countries, members of parliament, key members of parliament, these places are young. It's not a baby boomer post-Holocaust generation, of which I'm part of, but these are oftentimes people in their 30s and 40s. And one would think that the distance between 1945 and today would be such that they would be able to confront their past. One of the real tests of being a democracy, and we in this country do it all the time, is to look in the mirror and not only see the good, but also to see the bad, and to be able to address it. And it's a constant process. And that's been very disappointing, that this generation, this younger generation, is not able to come to grips with it. I mentioned Lithuania as an example. But I wanted to say one other thing. When one goes to the Holocaust Museum and one sees the cables between Rabbi Stephen Wise and the State Department, the administration, in the middle of the Holocaust, beginning of the Holocaust. Alan and I, when I went to the Jewish Archives, had an opportunity to see the cable from Gerhard Riedner, who was head of the World Jewish Congress office in Switzerland at the time, learning of the final decision, the solution, and sending that cable out. And frankly, we had no place to go. I mean, I asked my mother many, many times, what did you know? What did you know? All she could tell me is that her family in Lithuania had written to her, and this must have been early on, this must have been probably, I'm guessing, about 1940, asking that if she could, to be able to bring them over. And they were unable to, and they didn't understand the extent of it. And today, we have an office for Holocaust issues. We have a State Department that has been a partner with the Jewish community in working on these issues. And I say a partner because I can say, really, personal comment here, I think if one leaves the Czechs aside, the Czech Republic aside, it has been a difficult process all the way through. And to know that we have friends the State Department who can be helpful. Leading that effort, Ambassador Davidson, I think we are really very fortunate to live in these times to have that kind of relationship. So, Doug, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Davidson. As we begin our meeting of the Board of Governors, let me turn the podium to our Honorary President, Moishe Smith.